Roswell, Alien Interview, Chapter 14. Errol reviews the interview transcripts. Matilda O'Donnell McElroy, personal note. Shortly after I finished recounting the previous interview with Errol to the stenographer, I was summoned urgently to the office of the commanding officer of the base. I was escorted by 4 heavily armed military policemen. When I arrived, I was asked to be seated in a very large makeshift office that had been arranged with a conference table and chairs. In the office were several dignitaries I had seen at various times in the gallery. I recognized a few of them because they were famous men. I was introduced to these men, which included Army Air Force Secretary Symington, General Nathan Twining, General Jimmy Doolittle, General Vandenberg, and General Northstadt. To my surprise, Charles Lindbergh was also in the office. Secretary Symington explained to me that Mr. Lindbergh was there as a consultant to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Air Force. There were several other men present in the room who were not introduced. I assume these men were personal aides to the officers or agents of some intelligence service. All of this sudden attention, not only from the Secretary and generals, but from world-famous people as Mr. Lindbergh and Mr. Doolittle, made me realize how critically important my role as an interpreter for Errol was, as seen through the eyes of others. Until this time I was not really aware of this except in a peripheral sense. I suppose this was because I was so absorbed in details of the extraordinary situation. Suddenly I began to grasp the magnitude of my role. I think that the presence of these men in that meeting was intended, in part, to impress me with this fact. The secretary instructed me not to be nervous. He said that I was not in any trouble. He asked me if I thought the alien would be willing to answer a list of questions they had prepared. He explained that they were very eager to discover many more details about Errol, the flying disc, the domain, and many other subjects that Errol had disclosed in the interview transcripts. Of course, they were mainly interested in questions relating to the military security and the construction of the flying disc. I told them that I was very sure that Errol had not changed her mind about answering questions, as nothing had changed that would cause her to trust the intentions of the men in the gallery. I repeated that Errol had communicated everything that she was willing and at liberty to discuss already. In spite of this, they insisted that I would ask Errol again if she would answer questions, and the answer was still no. I was to ask her if she would be willing to read the written copies of the transcripts of my interview translations. They wanted to know if Errol would verify that my understanding and translation of our interviews was correct. Since Errol could not read English very fluently, the secretary asked if they could be allowed to observe for themselves while Errol read the transcripts and verify that they were correct in writing. They wanted her to write a copy of the transcripts, whether the translation were correct or not, and make a note of anything that was not accurate in the transcripts. Of course, I had no choice but to obey orders, and I did exactly what the secretary requested. I was given a copy of the transcripts with a signature page, which I was to show to Errol. After Errol completed her review, I was also directed to request that Errol sign the cover page, attesting that all the translations in the transcripts were correct as amended by her. About an hour later, I entered the interview room, as instructed, with copies of the transcripts and signature page to deliver to Errol, as the members of the gallery, including the generals, and Mr. Lindbergh also, I presume, and others watched through the glass of the gallery room. I went to my usual seat, sitting 4 or 5 feet across from Errol. I presented the envelope of transcripts to Errol and passed on the instructions I had received from the secretary telepathically. Errol looked at me and looked at the envelope without accepting it. Errol said, "If you have read them and they are accurate in your own estimation, there is no need for me to review them also. The translations are correct. You can tell your commander that you have faithfully conveyed a record of our communication." I assured Errol that I had read them, and they were exact recordings of everything I told the transcription typist. "Will you sign the page then?" I asked. "No, I will not," said Errol. "May I ask you why not?" I said. I was a little confused as to why she wasn't willing to do such a simple thing. If your commander does not trust his own staff to make an honest and accurate report to him, what confidence will my signature on the page give him? Why will he trust an ink mark on a page made by an officer of the domain if he does not trust his own loyal staff? I didn't quite know what to say to that. I couldn't argue with Errol's logic, and I couldn't force her to sign the document either. I sat in my chair for a minute, wondering what to do next. I thanked Errol and told her I needed to go ask my superiors for further instructions. I placed the envelope of the transcripts in the inside breast pocket of my uniform jacket, and I began to rise from my chair. At that moment, the door from the gallery room slammed open. 5 heavily armed military police rushed into the room. A man in a white laboratory coat followed closely behind them. He pushed a small cart that carried a box-shaped machine with a lot of dials on the face of it. Before I could act, 2 of the MPs grabbed Errol and held her firmly down on the oversized chair she had been sitting on since the first day of our interviews together. The other 2 MPs grabbed my shoulders and pushed me back down on my chair and held me there. The other MP stood directly in front of Errol, pointing a rifle directly at her, no more than 6 inches from her head. The man in the lab coat quickly wheeled the cart behind Errol's chair. He deftly placed a circular headband over Errol's head and turned back to the machine on the cart. Suddenly, he shouted the word, "Clear!" The soldiers who were holding Errol released her. At that instant, I saw Errol's body stiffen and shudder. This lasted for about 15 or 20 seconds. The machine operator turned a knob on the machine and Errol's body slumped back into the chair. After a few seconds, he turned the knob again and Errol's body stiffened as before. He repeated the same process several more times. I sat in my chair being held down all the while by the MPs, and I didn't understand what was going on. I was terrified and transfixed by what was happening. I couldn't believe it. After a few minutes, several other men wearing white lab coats entered the room. They briefly examined Errol, who was now slumped listlessly in the chair. They mumbled a few words to each other. One of the men waved to the gallery window. A gurney was immediately rolled into the room by 2 attendants. These men lifted Errol's limp body onto the gurney, strapped her down across the chest and arms, and rolled it out of the room. I was immediately escorted out of the interview room by the MPs and taken directly to my quarters, where I was locked in my room with the MPs remaining at guard outside the door. After about half an hour, there was a knock at the door of my quarters. When I opened it, General Twining entered, together with the machine operator in the white lab coat. The general introduced the man to me as Dr. Wilcox. He asked me to accompany him and the doctor. We left the room, followed by the MPs. After several twists and turns through the complex, we entered a small room where Errol had been wheeled on the gurney. The general told me that Errol and the domain were considered to be a very important military threat to the United States. Errol had been immobilized so that she could not depart and return to her base, as she said she would do in the interview. It would be a very grave risk to national security to allow Errol to report what she observed during her time at the base, so it had been determined that decisive action was needed to prevent this. The general asked me if I understood why this was necessary. I said that I did, although I most certainly did not agree that it was the least bit necessary. And I certainly did not agree with the surprise attack on Errol and me in the interview room. However, I said nothing about this to the general because I was very afraid of what might happen to me and Errol if I protested. Dr. Wilcox asked me to approach the gurney and stand next to Errol. Errol lay perfectly still and unmoving on the bed. I could not tell whether she was alive or dead. Several other men in white lab coats, who I assumed were also doctors, stood on the opposite side of the bed. They had connected 2 pieces of monitoring equipment to Errol's head, arms, and chest. One of these devices I recognized from my training as a surgical nurse as an EEG machine, which is used to detect electrical activity in the brain. The other device was a normal hospital room vital signs monitor, which I knew would be useless since Errol did not have a biological body. Dr. Wilcox explained to me that he had administered a series of mild electroshocks to Errol in an attempt to subdue her long enough to allow military authorities time to evaluate the situation and determine what to do with Errol. He asked me to attempt to communicate with Errol telepathically. I tried for several minutes but couldn't sense any communication from Errol. I couldn't even sense whether Errol was present in the body any longer. "I think you must have killed her," I said to the doctor. Dr. Wilcox told me that they would keep Errol under observation and I would be asked to return later to establish communication with Errol again.